So if you just watched the simpler videos and were following along with live, you may have noticed that the interface that I was using to explain simpler is not what it looks like anymore because they've updated it. And it's pretty rare that Ableton chooses to update any of their instruments. So I'm glad they did. I always love when they kind of like go through and kind of update things and modernize them. And they usually do a really good job of kind of taking it to the next level. So the new version of Simpler is a lot like the old version of Simpler. Pretty much everything that you learned about the old version of Simpler will apply to the new version with a handful of pretty cool new features, especially if you're using Push. A lot of these new features are designed to directly integrate with Push and using Push to slice up beats and kind of using that as part of your workflow. But once again, if you start off and you play some MIDI notes and there's no sample loaded up, it's not going to make any sound because it's a sampler. So I'm going to go over here to my samples folder and let me just find like a kick drum. Let's find one I like, click and I'll drag it in, and now I can play it. C3 is going to be a root note again, just like in the regular version of Simpler. We can actually open it up and we can see our interface a little bit different, and I'll just make it bigger if you want to. And that'll actually take the controls tab over here, which includes things like your filter, your LFO, your envelope, and allow you to see both of them at the same time. So we can see our sample stuff up here and then our filter, LFO, and envelope over here. Also at the bottom, you'll notice that I have controls for my filter, my LFO, and my envelope all down here. And when I switch over to the controls tab, it has all the same controls here. So it's the same thing either place. If I turn my attack up here, it's the same thing as turning it up over here. It doesn't really, it allows you to see both of them, or see those controls from both views at the same time, which is pretty handy. The main big difference in the new version of Sampler is that there are now 3 different modes that you can play your sample. We have Classic, which is going to operate pretty much exactly like the mode in the old version of Simpler. We have One Shot, which is designed for one shots, obviously, and then we have the Slice mode, which is super cool, and we'll get into that in a minute. But real quickly, in Classic, the thing that they've changed, this really kind of a big deal, is you can now warp your samples inside of Simpler. You could not do this before, and this is especially cool for things like loops. If you loaded up a loop into Simpler and tried to trigger it, it would not necessarily trigger in time, but now it will. And so automatically there's this, you can turn warp on and off here, but usually by automatically it should come on. I can choose different warp modes, all the same warp modes that we've seen before. I can choose to loop it or not loop it. I can snap it to grid. You're going to see a lot of these are going to be controls that you should be familiar with by now, having already seen the videos for Simpler. And then we have things like our attack decay sustain release down here. Pretty self-explanatory, not terribly exciting until we go in and maybe I'll grab a drum loop real quick. Cool, so I can take this and drag it in, and now if I turn on my metronome and start playing it, so it puts everything on the grid and it's amazing. So that's the Classic mode. And also notice that when I'm in Classic mode, if I let go of my MIDI note, if I play it and then let go, it stops playing. And then we have One Shot mode, which will default to trigger mode. So in this mode, the controls are slightly different. You can still choose to warp it or not warp it. And you can't loop in this mode. If I play it and I get to the end, it's just gonna stop playing. Hence the One Shot mode. Also notice in this mode, we instead of getting attack, decay, sustain, release, we have a fade in and a fade out, and you'll notice that we can actually see that on the interface itself. And we also get transposition down here, as well as velocity to volume and volume, as opposed to getting ADSR and then volume. It defaults to trigger mode, which means when I hit a note and I let go, it's just going to keep going until it gets to the end. I can switch it to gate mode, which means when I hold it down, it plays, and when I let go, it stops. So it's going to act a lot like the classic mode in that sense. And that's pretty much all the one-shot mode. And then we get into the slice mode, and this is super cool. So there are several different ways that Live will try to slice this for you. One is that the default mode will be transient. And so it's going to analyze your clip, and it's going to look for transient markers. And this is especially cool because it syncs up really nicely with how the push works in that in the other two modes. I'm going to get the standard like in-key mode that the push does. If you own a push, you should be familiar with that. In the slice mode, it switches to more kind of like a drum pad. So now I can play. Each individual slice directly from my push. I'm going to set this to trigger. And so I can see in here, there's a few places, like especially right here and right here, where it didn't slice it on an actual drum sound. It's kind of like, let me see if we can, it's not really, that's not something I actually want to play, right? So what I can do while I'm in transient mode is I can turn down my sensitivity, and so it'll decrease the sensitivity of where it slices. So if I turn up to 100, you can see there's red slices for all of there's different areas of my loop. As I turn this down, they become gray, and which means I now have less slices, and I won't actually be able to play these two areas as individual slices. So if I turn this down super low, you can see more and more of them get grayed out to the point where I only have 4 of them. So you can just basically have it automatically slice it up for you, which is super cool. And adjust the sensitivity so you can get the right amount of slices that you might want to work with. There's also slicing it by beat. So this will automatically slice it by a division of the beat. So right now it's set to quarter notes, so I've got 8 different slices. Super handy, and now I can go through and I can change the division of the grid, so I can make it 8 notes. I wouldn't necessarily make it 8 notes in this case because I've got a note right here. That's not really a sound for me to be playing. It's just kind of the tail end of the other one. So I wouldn't necessarily do 8 notes here, but you could kind of divide it up depending on the size of the grid you want to use. And then we have by region. And so this will automatically slice it by a certain number. So right now I've got 8 regions, and as I turn this up, I get more regions or less regions. So in the case of 2, I just have first half of it, or the second half of it. Not quite as useful as dividing it by beat, but there might be a few situations where you might just like want, I need 12 different slices. So turn up to 12, and now I've got 12 different slices. And then we got manual, which is super cool. So this will allow me to manually add in my own slices. So I can double click, and that will add in a slice anywhere I want. You can also, with the push, you can turn this on so I can trigger it, and when I hit my push again, it'll make a new slice for me. And once I have this slice, I can, if my timing gets messed up, I can move it exactly where I want it to start. So now I can have a slice right there. So you can customize exactly how many slices you want through any of these modes. I think transient's probably the most useful. It's probably my favorite just because it automatically looks for the transients and does the work for you. And then all you have to do is just adjust the sensitivity. So you can choose how many slices you want. So this is really fun for just taking an idea and being able to slice it up and play different bits of it and kind of rearrange a drum beat that you already like. And this is kind of like a more like old school hip hop style of producing and kind of taking a beat, slicing it up, turning it something different. A lot of like jungle and drum and bass was made using this kind of method of taking one beat, slicing it up, and then you can change the tempo, move things back and forth, rearrange it, kind of build your own style out of a different kind of drum. And then the controls tab is all the same basic controls. Get a pitch envelope here. We can turn that on and off. LFO here goes to your filter frequency. You have your filter here. All kind of stuff we've seen before in not only the old version of Simpler, but in pretty much every other device we've seen in live. So hopefully that makes sense. If you know and understand the regular version of Simpler, this is really not too much of a leap to kind of figure this one out. There's just a couple cool new things. Like the big thing for me is warping and then the slice mode. Those kind of really open up your options in terms of what you can do with Simpler. And I also think they kind of cleaned up the interface a little bit, which makes it a little easier to use and a little nicer to use. And just as you could before with the regular Simpler, you can control click at the top here and convert it into a sampler if you want to later on. And but keep in mind, this is important, that sampler, you still can't warp in it. And so if you were working in Simpler and then you convert it into sampler, the warping you're using won't be maintained as you go from one to another. So watch out for that. If you are planning on going from Simpler into sampler, it might make a big difference if you're using any of the warping. So hopefully that makes it a little easier getting into it. It's a lot of fun. It's actually, the old Simpler is one of my favorite devices, and they just kind of made it better, which is great. They didn't really change any of the old features that were already there.